Dear teachers and the students, we provide simultaneous interpreting service. You can select the Chinese or English channel, and you can select the channel in the right bottom. So it is a reminder. And secondly, at the end of our dialogue, we will save some time. We will reserve some time for the online and offline guests for exchanges and questions. And if you have any questions, you can type the question in the chat box. And our working staff will collect the questions and we will select some questions and provide answers. Okay, let's formally start now. Dear experts, audience, teachers and students, good evening. I come from UNESCO INRULED. My name is Sang Guoyuan. I'm the moderator of today's event. And the topic of today's event is the provision and retention of qualified rural teachers, government responsibility or social contract. And in terms of the selection of this topic, actually we respond to the report by UNESCO that is to reshaping our common future, a new social contract. And in this document, it is proposed that we will build a new social contract and all stakeholders will be included in this social contract so that with considered efforts, we will realize the vision of education as our common objective. And from the perspective of rural teachers, we will contribute to the global and China's rural revitalization and rural development. So in this background, UNESCO INRULED invited experts from China, 3 experts from China and 1 expert from Belgium and one expert from Cameroon, and he is still to be online. And we will organize such a high-end forum. We will talk about the role of rural teachers in the development of rural education. And we will discuss the provision and retention of qualified rural teachers. First of all, I would like to introduce you our participants. And first, international expert. He is from Ghent University, Belgium. And he is the Dean of the Psychology Education Faculty, Mr. Martin Wackel. And I would like to introduce Eric. He comes from Menbada University of Cameroon. No, Bamenda University. Professor Kembinkiri, Eric. Professor Kembinkiri is engaged in rural education for a long time, and he has a great achievement. And Professor Martin Warko is engaged in education in Asia, South America, and he is engaged in education assistance program and also provided suggestions to the education policy in EU. And now I will turn the camera to China. And beside me is a professor who is a very famous scholar, Professor Teng Xin. He is from Minzu University of China, namely MUC. He has organized rural education assistance programs in international organizations. And our online guest comes from Northwestern Normal University, Mr. Li Jinyu. We know that Northwestern Normal University is located in Gansu province, which is in northwest China. Gansu province actually is lagging behind in rural education development. So in the past, many international organizations and also ADB and other institutions have already carried out many education assistance programs in Gansu province, and Professor Li Jinyu also participated in such programs. And we also have a young professor, Mr. Qin Yuyou. He comes from Northeast Normal University, the Research Institute of Rural Education. And if you have paid attention to this area, you may know that Northeast Normal University and the Research Institute of Rural Education Development and Professor Qin Yuyou are in a leading position in this area. Okay, Eric is online. Okay, let's continue. We are looking forward that through organizing such an event by INRULED, not only in rural education and rural teachers and rural development and gender equality, the international dialogues in such topics, we hope that we can establish a bridge to gather the stakeholders who have interest in such topics. We hope to provide a high-end international platform for your discussion and exploration. So the first topic is about the supply-side reform of teachers. This is a hot topic recently, and it has attracted much attention. And usually, we focus around the model of teacher training and about the curriculum of teacher training and how to attract more excellent talents to enter the teachers' workforce. So the first topic is, what are the situations and the challenges on the provision and the retention of rural teachers in different countries such as China, Cameroon, Belgium, or other European countries? For example, Professor Martin Vacco can introduce their situation in Belgium. So the current situation and the challenges on the provision and the retention of rural teachers. So first of all, Professor Li, please talk about this topic. Thank you. Okay, it's my turn. So I will share with you my thoughts on this topic. Dear teachers from BNU and two international experts, and then Mr. Qin, Professor Sang, good evening. So the first topic, what are the situations and the challenges on the provision and the retention of rural teachers in different countries? I would like to talk about the situation in China. And in terms of the provision and retention of rural teachers, actually, in terms of the challenges, we need to answer three questions. First, do rural areas really need teachers? So we would like to respond to this question from two aspects. First, we should need teachers, but from another perspective, in terms of the reality, we need to think whether we really need rural teachers. And another question based on that question is how many teachers we need in rural areas, and what kind of or what types of teachers are needed for rural areas. So the three questions should be put on the basis of the first question. And from the reality of China, and the teachers are identified as the occupations with strong policy properties, and they belong to the positions in the national undertakings. Actually, the provision and the retention of rural teachers in China actually has very strong policy properties. And there is a contradiction between supply and demand. And we have conducted a survey in some northwest region in China, and it includes the mode of training and the demand for the quantity and the demand for structure and requirement for the qualifications. And from the policies of the provision and the retention of rural teachers, we summarized the principle that we should cultivate high-quality rural teachers and retain them, and also enable them to provide high quality education. However, we still face some difficulties because the teachers are unable or have difficulty in fulfilling such objectives.
Are there corresponding linear relation between the questions and the solution? I don't think so. Why do I think like this? Because we only take into consideration about how to teach the teacher and how could the teacher do a good job. And we have neglect and outlet problem. Means the front enrollment, the outlet means how to. So in the front end today, who are providing teachers to the rural areas in China, who are doing the provision. This is essential to talk about the supply, provision, and the retention. In normal universities, we have three types of universities. First, the universities under the supervision of the Ministry of Education. They can provide and cultivate high quality teachers. Second type is the normal university under the management of the province. It can provide teachers for the cities and the counties. The third type is a local university. Recent years, they are providing teachers for the rural areas in China. They are the main coming source for the rural area teachers. You can see that for the teachers in the three different types of universities, they must have different qualities. And in terms of China's college entrance examination, and we know that different types of universities will enroll different qualities of teachers and students. So from the front end, from the supply side, there is unpreparedness. You can stop it later. We will come back and you can revisit this topic. With this, we will invite Dr. and Professor Val to share history, and then we'll give the floor to Mr. Henry Eric Lin. The floor is yours, Professor Val.
Okay, do you see my screen now? Can someone confirm whether they can see my screen?
Yes, I can see it.
Oh, okay, thank you. So thank you for this invitation. It's very honorful, and I really appreciate the focus you have on teacher provision and retention, because this is really a worldwide problem. This first question looks at the situation and the challenges. I will start from the Belgian perspective, but it applies, in fact, to most of Western Europe. We have two big problems, in fact. The first one is enrollment in teacher education that will lead to a provision. And we see a decline in enrollment of 50% in the last 10 years. So this immediately will affect the provision of new teachers. Secondly, we see in European countries that the qualifications of students entering the teacher education programs is going down. Okay, so it attracts, in fact, you could say, the wrong students. And then something often neglected is that 3/4 of the teachers are female. And this really poses also a problem as to the fit between the teacher and the educational system. When we look at retention, the retention rate is in fact growing. It's now 40% of new teachers that stop within the 5 years after they enter the profession. There is a yearly decline in numbers of available teachers in the schools of 1.5%. And so the next year it's 1.5% on top of the former 1.5%. Currently, 4% of the classroom sessions are not run by sufficiently qualified teachers. And this is especially the case in sciences, mathematics, so the rather complex domains, you could say. And very importantly, and here we look a little bit in a different way to the problem as compared to China, contextual variables are strongly associated with, in fact, social economical status problems. So when we look at teachers in relation to geographical areas, then you will see in Western Europe, because it's heavily urbanized, okay, rural areas are not really the problem. it's the city areas where you have the problem, and especially the center of the city area, because there you have a concentration of low SES students going to school. And to exemplify that, I will show you the example of one big city in Western Europe. It's Antwerp, where there is an extreme shortage, in fact, in teachers, where you even have now schools simply closing down because of a lack of teachers. So I will show you 3 maps. And the problems are the same in the Netherlands, in the UK, in Germany. But this is the map of one part of Belgium. And you see here a very dark spot. This is the center of the city of Antwerp, the dark spot. And this map shows you where the kids, the children who live in the city, where they go to school. And you see that large groups, they do not go to school, to the city schools. No, they go outside the city. So the big question is, what children remain in the city center? And then you will see, if you look at the percentage of children who, for instance, stay behind, or retained in the system, they don't go to the next school year, you see that the highest percentage in the country is in the city center schools. Also, if you look at the SES, so the social economic status of these children, you see that in this area, geographical area, you see the same in the city center of Brussels, for instance, but also in Antwerp, you see that you have the highest percentage of children with low SES. So there's a clear relationship in our countries. It's the same in the Netherlands, in the UK, in Germany and France, that we have a lack of teachers in the city center schools. And it's mainly linked to the problem related to these children they have to work with. Teachers are no longer willing to teach in these schools because of all the difficulties related to this. So what is the problem? Teachers are not up to the task. Their competences in relation to classroom management are difficult, and there is a non-manageable diversity in the students. For instance, in my city where I live here, we have more than 100 different mother tongues. And these kids, they enter the school and the teachers are hardly able to manage this. And this leads to aggression problems, bullying problems, and so on. Thank you for your attention. I will stop sharing my screen.
那么刚才我们也看
Thank
到
you for the sharing. We have seen that developed countries and developing countries, there are significant obvious differences. In developed countries, many students with high SES, they are preferring to go to the suburb schools. But while the students with low SES, they would like to go to the city center schools. This is quite contrary to the situation in developing countries. With that, we'll give the floor to Professor Kimberly Eric Lin to share his opinion on the provision and retention of rural teachers.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. The situation in Cameroon, in Africa, specifically Cameroon, it's pathetic. We have insufficient qualified teachers, especially at the rural areas, as compared to the cities. In many of our rural schools, it's difficult to find 2 or 3 trained teachers per school. Many are in the town, in the cities. Notwithstanding, the government is doing a lot to support schools and teachers in the rural areas. Teachers, upon completion of training, are signed an undertaking to make sure that they stay in the schools where they are posted for at least 3 to 5 years. So they are obliged to stay in the rural areas before thinking of moving from those rural areas. Again, the government also authorizes the creation of PTAs, that is the Parent Teachers Associations, to support teachers in the rural areas. Teachers in Africa and especially Cameroon, the situation of teachers in the rural areas is a very, very complex one because of the problems faced in our rural areas. In our rural areas, we lack so many amenities, for example, basics like water, electricity. So the conditions in the rural areas are not very favorable. So many schools, they lack teachers. Thank you very much.
Both answers from Cameron. We know that due to the poor infrastructure in rural areas, there is insufficient supply of teachers, especially high quality teachers. Thank you for the responses from the three speakers. Will Professor Qin and Professor Tang, do you have anything to share with us? After listening to your sharing from domestic and overseas professors, I feel I learned a lot. I'd like to give you a brief sharing of my own feelings. The first question is the national policy in terms of teacher provision and retention in different countries. I will put up and list several national policies in China. We first admit there are some problems in the rural education in China.
Local governments also promoting some local level policies. And we can see that in which area we recruit how many special teachers. I think this is important supplement or support to the building of the workforce of rural teachers. And in 2015, there is a rural teacher support program from 2015 to 2020. Actually, this program has injected vitality to the development of rural teachers and solved the problem of lack of rural teachers. And in 2018, the State Council Office issued a notice on comprehensively supporting the rural teachers' development, and especially attach great importance to the development of rural teachers so that we can solve the problems in rural schools. And we adopted different policies to support the development of rural teachers in rural areas so that the village and township schools can carry out the curriculum better. And the quality education program also provide daily life services and boarding services. So a series of policies have been adopted to solve the problem in rural teachers. Of course, China is a big country, so the implementation of such policies will be different in different regions. And in the rapid urbanization of rural areas, new problems will emerge. So in this process, our policies will also be adaptable, be adaptive to the changes in this process. And from the effect perspective, we see that we have already achieved a preliminary result. Overall speaking, the policy have achieved positive results. And what are the challenges we face? Just now, the Chinese professors and foreign professors have already talked about, and I would like to share you from three aspects. First, we have sufficient graduates in education. However, they are not so targeted in the specific areas of rural education. And secondly, the standards for rural education is changing. However, we have no specific attention to that aspect. And thirdly, the provision of rural teachers has already made some improvement. However, the high quality or qualified rural teachers are still lacking. So these are the three problems. And actually, we share many similar problems. Thank you, Professor Qin. And next, I would like to invite Professor Teng to share with your perspectives. You have rich experience in some ethnic minority areas, and many rural schools also have ethnic properties, and some rural schools are located in remote areas. So these rural areas belong to the ethnic minority areas. So would you please share about the policies for rural teachers. I will save time. Okay, I think to save time, we just move to the second question. The second question is regarding the provision and the retention of rural teachers. What are the policies or actions on the provision and retention of rural teachers from the policy perspective? And from the beginning of the 1980s, I started to conduct a survey, field survey in some ethnic minority areas. So I'm quite familiar with the situation of rural teachers in the ethnic minority areas. I would like to talk about this aspect. Just now, our foreign experts already talked about some policies in their respective countries. Actually, there is some difference between developed countries and developing countries. And China has a large territory area. And actually, there is also a vast difference in the rural teachers between different regions in China. First, we need to review the history of the rural education. After 70 years of the foundation of the People's Republic of China, we experienced two different systems. First, from the 1950s to the 1970s, we carried out the planned economy system. And under such system, there is a big difference between rural area and urban area. And the rural areas are suffering from poverty. Therefore, there is a lack of rural teachers in terms of quantity and quality. So before the 1990s, especially before the reform and opening up, rural teachers usually have rather low education background, and there is a lack of sufficient number of rural teachers, and their quality are low. And with the national development of China, actually we have made a great improvement in China, especially after the poverty alleviation policy. There has been great changes in the rural schools, and including Qilianshan Mountain in the rural area. In the past, the school was very old, and the teachers have many problems in quantity and quality and their structure. But this year, I visited this rural school in the remote rural area. It was a very small-scale kindergarten, but this year I saw that the hardware infrastructure was greatly improved, even better than a school in Beijing. Of course, the quality of the rural teachers still has room for improvement. Therefore, we need to have a historical perspective. In different time periods, the rural teachers have different problems in terms of provision and retention. And the second is diversity, because China is a very big country, and we have 56 ethnic groups, and we have different dialects in different regions. So this leads to the diversity of education in different regions. And even today, the problems in rural education are also different in different regions. For example, in Zhejiang province, which is located in the Yangtze River Delta, and in Guangdong province, actually the schools in rural areas and the rural teachers have no big difference with those in big cities. But if we are in a remote rural area, actually they still have a large difference with the big countries. So we need to pay attention to the regional differences. And in the ethnic minority areas, after several decades of development, we have improved the education background of rural teachers. So from the perspective of education background of the rural teachers, actually, they made a lot of improvement. However, in the ethnic minority areas, there is a structural problem in the provision of rural teachers. For example, in Gansu province, in the south of Gansu province, in the Tibetan school, there is a lack of science teachers who can speak Tibetan language. So this is a structural problem in the provision of rural teachers. And it's a pervasive problem in the ethnic minority areas, such as Xinjiang and Tibet. In such schools, in these ethnic minority areas, the teachers who majored in Tibetan language, they teach science in the school. So this is a very prominent issue to be solved. This is a structural problem. And fourthly, recently, in recent 10 years, our government has introduced many policies. For example, the national level training and special training policies, etc. However, actually, we have not formed a systematic mechanism for implementing such policies. So how to solve this problem? Last year, one of my students conducted a survey in his doctoral thesis on the topic of the movement of rural teachers. I suggested him to study why the rural teachers move from the theory of immigration. So that is the rule why the people move to a higher position. People tend to move to more developed areas. And it's the same case for the rural teachers. They tend to move from less developed regions to more developed areas because they seek better benefits and compensations. And in some cases, the teachers come to rural areas due to economic or cultural reasons or due to the folk customs. So to solve the movement of rural teachers from the supply side, we needed to study the reasons behind which lead to the movement of the rural teachers. So we need to address the problem from the root cause. And sixth, in recent 10 years, I focused on developing curriculum for rural education and also developing the textbooks for rural education. Why I do this work? Because the teachers graduating from normal university, they usually teach the modern knowledge they acquired in cities. However, they do not understand the local knowledge or the specific knowledge about the national ethnic minority areas. So if the teachers do not teach the specific local knowledge, then the students, when they grow up, they lack such specific education. They will forget what their ancestors are, and they are just like rootless persons, and they do not know their origin, their ancestors, their history, etc.
People below 50 years old, they cannot speak their original ethnic language. But in China, we don't have such policy. So after 15 years, the ethnic group people, they could not speak their native ethnic language. We think that the ethnic group language, culture, and art are also the soft power of China, are also an important part of the global intangible heritage. So I strongly recommend that besides the universal knowledge, we should also teach the traditional excellent traditions. So I believe in supply side, we can implement not only the universal language training and universal knowledge training, but also ethnic group knowledge and the tradition training. Just now, Professor Teng and Professor Qin has shared with us about the teacher education current situation, especially the rural area teachers. Professor Qin has talked about the implementation of national policies and how to embody the differentiation and the localization in the implementation of national policies. And Professor Qin also shared with us how to improve the situation with the implementation of the national policy. With that, we'll give the floor to Professor Wang and Professor Eric Lin. In your countries, are there national policies or regional policies and documents to ensure the training, provision, and retention of teachers? Professor Wang?
I will focus on short-term and
从短期、
long-term
长
policy
期
measures.
的
Some of these measures are really
有一些
emergency
措施呢，
measures. One of the first emergency solutions is
第
to,
一
in
个
fact,
应急
simply
的
to
措施
allow
就是我
in
们
fact lower entry
允许
qualifications for teachers.
教
We have
师
now,
水
for
平或
instance,
教师背景
schools
不
in
足
the
够的老师也
Netherlands
可以
and
进
in our
入
country
小
where
学，
it
比
is
如说在荷
allowed
兰和比
that
利时，我们
students with
允许
only
这
a
样的
secondary
情况，
education
就是
backgrounds
说
they
他们有一
help
个
in
中
the
专教育
schools.
的
A second short-term solution
第
is
二个
that
短
we
期的
attract a
方
new
法
kind of teachers
就是我们
that
可
are
以进一
working
些
in the
新的
private
老师
market.
部
And
门，
these could be
在社
people
会
now with
工作
up
的
to
老师
10
呢，
years of
把他们
expertise,
招
and
聘
they're
到我
even
们的
get
教育
paid
体
in
系
that
中，
way.
可能他
And
们
there
的
is a
工
call
作
even to
经验
look
比
for
较
people
长，
with up to 20 years of
他
expertise,
们
and
有
they
10
would be
年的
paid
经
for
验，甚至有
expertise.
多
Third
出一些报
solution
酬。
is to allow
第
secondary
三个
school
解决方
teachers
案呢，
to teach
我们就是
more
让一
hours
些
per week
初中
and
的
also
老
are
师呢，
paid
让他们上
accordingly.
课的
And the third one is that we changed, in
最
fact,
后呢，
the initial training program
我们
for
对于教
senior
师
high
的
school
培训呢，
teachers. It is now a full master's
对于
degree and not only a
高中
certificate.
的
And we
老师
hope that this
的
will
教育背
attract
景进行了改革。
more
现在
and
呢，我们
better
需要他们
teachers.
都会了
Secondly,
解
we have the
这个背景。
long-term solutions. We see that most schools, they
我们发
hire
现
teachers
大部分的
as a
学
school
校
unit.
在
We
招聘
changed
老
now
师的时候，
that
让他们成
policy
为一个教
and we build
学
up
校的共同体，
larger
学校的联
school
盟。
communities. So it means
也
5,
就是说，
6, 10,
比如说5
12
个、6
schools
个、10
work
个学
together
校，把他们
to
融合在
hire
一起
teachers
去
and
招
then
聘
to
老师，
even transfer teachers from
然后
one
甚至还
school
在
to
这
the
个
other,
学校
or
的
they
共同
work
体内，
together.
老
This
师
has
之
already
间轮岗。
started this policy, and it affects already in a
我们
positive way the
现
provision
在
of
已经
good
执行了
qualified
这样的。
teachers. The second measure long term is that
第
we
二个
redevelop the
长期
career
的方案，
perspective for teachers. In the old days, teachers, they were the same kind of teacher for 40 years. But now we start distinguishing between a starting teacher, an experienced teacher, and a key teacher. So this makes it possible that teachers can also diversify in their professional activities. And that's comparable to what happens in other jobs. For instance, like nurses and hospitals, we had the same problem with provision and retention of nurses. This has changed, especially because developing a new career model where people can evolve in their job. The third long-term measure being developed now is to define a new type of staff member. Why is there a need of a new kind of staff member? Well, because teachers have to spend a lot of time doing administrative tasks and all kinds of non-essential tasks. This new staff member would have a kind of between secondary education, higher education qualifications, 2 years, and it would be someone enrolled to do the routine jobs, so that the teacher really can concentrate on the core business of his or her job. And then the fourth thing is, and again, building on the complaint of teachers leaving the profession, is that teachers have to do multiple things in schools. So we would try to limit teachers' jobs to the teaching activities, and so that less jobs are being presented to them related to guidance activities, taking care of children with emotional and behavioral problems, and so on. And this diversification in staff in school would also help that the teacher job becomes more attractive. So when you look at the short-term and the long-term measures being taken at policy level, they try to influence the provision of more teachers on the one hand, and to retain teachers in the system on the other hand. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Bock. 2 points really worth recognition. With developing countries, including China, should learn from Belgium. The first point is the school community. The school community is not only a community informed, but several countries, several schools, they are join in community. They hire teacher together, and the teacher hired in this way will provide the education and the teacher to the school community. This is really innovative measure. The second point is how to relieve the teachers' pressure. In China, teachers' pressure really deserve our attention. How to help the teachers reduce the pressure? Professor Balk has provided a good suggestion that we can assign other staff to help and take care of the non-central work of the teachers. Thank you, Professor Balk. Professor Eric Lin?
Can you hear me now? Thank you.
Yes.
Permit me start by saying that the teaching profession is no longer very attractive as before in Cameroon and in Africa. Consequently, the best graduates from academic institutions prefer other professions to the teaching profession. Also, we have a problem of a rapid increase in population that doesn't correspond with the number of teachers that are trained every year. We have also a problem of migration. People are moving for various reasons from the rural areas. Teachers are moving for various reasons. Some are moving for greener pastures, for better, probably, conditions of living in the cities. Some are moving for family reunion reasons. Some are thinking of co-professional activities, for example, doing business, because the pay package for teachers is not very encouraging. Notwithstanding, the government of Cameroon and private individuals, denominations are doing a lot as far as the provision of teachers is concerned. It's also important to note that in Cameroon, we train teachers for different levels of education. We train teachers for basic education, that is primary and nursery education. We train teachers for secondary education, and there are teachers for higher education. The government trains every year teachers, depending on the means, because government has budgetary constraints at times when it comes to training of teachers. So every year there is a quota that is defined as far as numbers to be trained every year. Since the government cannot do it alone, the government authorizes denominations and private individuals also to take the responsibility of training teachers. So teachers are trained in Cameroon by the public, by those who are supposed to teach, called civil servants by the state. We have private teachers who end up teaching in private institutions, and then we have lay private teachers that are trained by private individuals. So we have different categories of teachers in Cameroon. And the problem is that this variety also goes with diversity in salaries, making it very difficult for some teachers, especially teachers in the private sector. So the teachers in the public sector comparatively are better in terms of pay package, whereas those in the private sector, especially in denominational institutions, end up not receiving a very good pay package. Now, education is very important. The government considers education very important, especially teacher training. Why? Because the government has ratified a lot of national and international instruments that obliges the government to make sure that it trains teachers, but these teachers are not enough. I must say that they are grossly insufficient when we look at the teachers that are being trained in Cameroon. So here at the level of the basic and primary education, we have teachers who have a lot of pressure because they have to teach all the subjects in this class. So we don't have different kinds of teachers to teach different kinds of subjects at the basic level. So a teacher teaches all the subjects. At the secondary level, it's discipline for the Anglophone, because in Cameroon, we have the French system of education and the English system of education. For the French system of education, the language of instruction is the French language. And for the English system of education, the language of instruction is the English language. So for the English system of education, we have teachers that are trained to teach disciplines. So the English system of education is disciplinary oriented, whereas the French system of education is not like that. It's more broader, where teachers can teach at least one or two disciplines, unlike in the English subsystem of education. So when we look at it, the situation at the level of basic secondary usually is not very, very favorable as compared to higher education. So many teachers, for example, secondary school teachers, are thinking of going further or furthering their education, probably to get a space where in higher education. So in higher education is better. Graduate PhD holders are recruited to teach by the government and by private higher institutions. So in a nutshell, that is the situation of education when it comes to provision, retention, and what the state is doing and the other individuals to promote the provision of teachers and retention of teachers. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kibin-Kiri, for your response. And we listened to the response from Belgium and Cameroon. And we have learned about the difference with China's situation, because China has a central authority, and we have a top-down policy to introduce policies to provide the guarantee at that policy level, and the compensation and the benefits for teachers are improving. For example, the teachers working in rural schools will enjoy better compensation and benefits than the teachers working in urban areas. Okay, this is the second question. And the third question, and Professor Kibin-Kiri, please make a preparation for this question, because we know that in African countries, there are many civil society organizations which are engaged in the training of teachers. So first of all, I would like to Professor Li to share with us, and when Professor Li is speaking, Dr. Kibin-Kiri can make some preparations for this question. Professor Li, please unmute. Thank you, Professor Sang. When I was making preparation for the topics of today's dialogue, I retrospected my experience in engaging in some NGO events. And actually, I have participated in 17 public welfare projects, including the technology education training problems in Gansu province, and other civil society organizations programs by national or international organizations, and the UNICEF programs, etc. So for this topic, it's very good. So if we talk about the social contract, we will talk about the problems of rural teachers from the perspective of social contract. So to solve the problem of rural teachers, we not only need the policy efforts, we also need to make efforts in social contract. In China's culture, actually, we have used a lot of social contract mentality in promoting rural education. For example, perseverance and dedication are two frequently used words in terms of rural education and rural teachers. Actually, the two words have contained very rich thoughts about social contract, and we have been always encouraging rural teachers to love and be loyal to the rural education. And this mentality has also been included in a policy for rural education. So from the perspective of social contract, actually policy and social contract, they share some commonalities. And in many policies of rural education, we can see that the subsidies for rural teachers and the establishment of honor system for rural teachers, actually such policies are also associated with the mentality of social contract. And in terms of the attention to rural education, different social organizations and international organizations are based on the principle of differentiation, and they devoted their passion and dedication to promote the development of rural education. So we are based on the principle of social contract, and we used the way of social contract to promote the development of rural education. I'm deeply touched by that. And when I was engaged in such public welfare programs, the methods and the modes are very unique. So I often feel that public welfare organizations are not only supplementary efforts, actually, they are also driving forces for the development of rural education. For example, the training of participatory education have been already gradually developed and implemented in rural schools in Gansu province, and now this model of education have been recognized by a large number of teachers. So the public welfare organizations are also driving forces. Thank you, Professor Li, for your answer. Professor Teng, do you have any supplement? In terms of the public welfare organizations, their role in promoting the development of rural education. Just now, Professor Li mentioned that he participated in some programs. For example, the programs of World Bank or ADB, UNESCO, and also Hong Kong organization. Actually, I also participated in such programs. I think the civil organizations since 1980s have already made a great contribution to promoting the rural education, especially when the government financial support is insufficient. They play a leading role. And the compulsory education in rural areas is a government responsibility. And in any country, rural education should be a government responsibility instead of the responsibility of social organizations. So social organizations are just supplementary. They can attempt to supplement, but the basic rural teachers' development in terms of quantity and quality should be the responsibility of our government in this aspect. Our government has a long way to go. And now we have sufficient quantity in provision of rural teachers and their education background is also sufficient. However, are they qualified for the rural education? We must put a question mark here because although some teachers, they have already reached the requirement for the education level, but their teaching quality is not qualified. And besides that, we also have structural problem. For example, we supply 100 or 10 or 1,000 or 10,000 physics teachers. Such teachers must graduated from the specific majors of the normal universities. We should not let the teachers specialized in language to teach the science subjects. So in this way, we solve the problem of the improvement of rural teacher quality. Thank you, Professor Teng.
NGO and international organizations can only play the supplementary role. The main role lies on the shoulder of the government. Chinese government is also making the effort in making more investment to improve the infrastructure and teachers' quality in rural areas. It's an ongoing process.
Thank you very much, Chair. Yeah, just to say that the role of civil society organizations, both national and international organizations, has been very important in education in Cameroon and in Africa. We've had organizations, national organizations like the World Bank, the IMF projects for recruitment and payment of teachers in Cameroon. Other organizations like USAID, Catholic Relief Service, the American Embassy, the French Embassy, the Chinese government has been very instrumental in helping teachers to develop innovative approaches, to develop skills. So they've been very influential in pre-service training and also in continuous professional development in Cameroon. So they've been very instrumental in training and also in continuous professional training. They've also been instrumental in the provision of both material and financial resources, both to teachers and also to learners. So of recent, I participated in the project organized by the French government, IFADEM, where we develop, where we identify problems faced by teachers and schools in Cameroon, and also try to see how we could propose solutions, sustainable solutions that could address the problem of teachers. So I must say that civil society organizations have been very, very helpful as far as education is concerned in Cameroon.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your answer. UNESCO INRULED as an organization under UNESCO, we have the social responsibility to help promote the rural education in not only China, but also other developing countries in the world. I'm looking for more cooperation between INRULED and Cameroon. And then this is our question 3, from practical challenge to national policy, and then we come back to the role of civil society organizations. Then we'll approach the individual teachers to see the role of individual teacher in the provision and the retention of rural teachers, and to talk about the dedication and sacrifice of the rural teachers, and what kind of efforts should the individual teachers do. Now we have many teachers from the rural areas who are joining us online and from the Bilibili website. So for those teachers, we like to give them feasible suggestions. We'll give the floor to Professor Qin. Please unmute yourself. This is a very essential question. Rural teachers, what kind of role could they play in rural education? And from the individual teacher's perspective, what's the outlook of the rural education? So the answer to the question 1, rural teachers, in talking about the civil society organization, I think the rural teachers, what should they do? First, the size of the rural teacher is very large. First, I think to improve the rural education, first and foremost, it's national responsibility, but also it has the it also falls on the responsibility of the individual teachers to build a high qualified teacher team for the rural education. We should stress dedication and sacrifice because we have 2 points involved. First, it's the national need. Second, it's the market need. The market determines that the teacher is as an important economic source, economic element. It should move freely. So people often move to better positions with a better economical income. This is understandable. Now, rural people and rural teachers can go to cities and go to better areas, and they're pursuing quality and pursuing work with a better productivity and with better income. Because frankly speaking, the infrastructure and the income and the living condition in rural areas is lagging behind of those of the cities. So to solve this problem, we should stress and put the emphasis on the dedication and the sacrifice of the teachers. We should admire the dedication from the rural teachers. So on this condition, I have several points to make. The first point is we should make an economical design. For example, so we should give more subsidies or allowances to teachers for their traveling expenses and extra living expenses for the teachers to work in the rural areas. The national institutions should give extra subsidy or allowances to teachers who work in the rural areas. The second point is for the rural teachers, they are willing to dedicate themselves to the rural areas. But if their choice in rural education will deprive themselves of the better development opportunities, this will not be desirable. So we should provide equal development opportunities to the rural teachers. So the rural teachers will be more confident about their work and they are more optimistic about their future, which will give them more confidence for them to stay in the rural areas. Third, the differences in working and living conditions. We know clearly there are big differences in the work conditions between city and the rural areas. And different schools may also differ in working conditions. So we should try to improve the working and living condition of rural teachers. So we should, in terms for the differences, we should provide incentives to the teachers live and work in rural areas. In brief, we should give more incentives to the rural teachers. And in terms of the working hour KPI, for teachers who give longer teaching work hours, we should give them higher salaries and provide higher income with economic incentive will encourage teachers to work in the rural areas. Right now, we raise ethical requirements and political requirements to encourage teachers to work in the rural areas. Frankly speaking, we should give more economic incentives to the rural teachers. For example, the subsidies and allowances. And I think the Ministry of Education should also take into consideration the subsidy and economic incentives measures. First and foremost, as I've said before, we should stress the dedication and the sacrifice spirit of the rural areas. This is a dual method. We should have the dual method come into play. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Qin. Yeah, you mentioned a great point. 3 years ago, while I was working in Lijiang, you talked about the differences incentive. While I was in Lijiang, in Yulong, if a teacher worked in a very remote area in Yulong, and his monthly salary will be 1,900 RMB higher than those who work in the cities. By giving economic incentives, more teachers will be willing to go working in the rural areas for a long time. And also some teachers mentioned that due to the poor education condition and hospital healthcare condition, the rural teachers are difficult to stay in the rural areas for a long time. About 10 years ago, I visited Taiwan. I visited a very remote area. I visited a school there. I encountered 2 teachers from Kaohsiung who went to work by motorcycle, and they are teachers in that school. I asked them, why do they take all the trouble and traveled all the way to work in this remote area? And their answer is very simple: high income. I'm thinking, how can we encourage the high quality teachers in the city center to work in the suburb and the remote areas? We now, Beijing, have some pilot programs. I strongly believe that we should put more effort in expanding and scaling up the pilot programs. Because, for example, in Beijing, we have many high-quality teachers who are retired. If we, put the retired teachers to the remote rural areas, then this will be one stone, kill 2 birds. I think people, they go for interest. They chose the interest. But on the other hand, people also have ideals. They pursue their ideals. So on one hand, people pursue wealth, but on the other hand, people, they want to pursue the ideals. So from these 2 perspectives, we should figure out measures to encourage teachers to work in the rural areas.
So that the teachers will have ideals. And last year, Peking University Social Sciences Research Institute invited me and a graduate, Mr. Xiao. After graduation, he went to US, and after graduation, he worked in the Fortune 500 company in US, and later he went back to China and established his own company. But one day he felt that his life was meaningless, so he went to travel in Western region in China, and he found that in some local schools in the remote rural areas, there is a lack of schools. So upon seeing that, he created a local school in the remote rural area. And in the previous half of this year, he organized a meeting. He also invited me, and we discussed the education in rural schools. So I think we not only provide institutional arrangement for the teachers so that they will be rest assured they have a systematic guarantee that they will teach in the rural schools for some years and finally they will return back to the cities. And on the other hand, we also mobilize the initiatives of the teachers so that they can also pursue their ideals in this process of rural education. Thank you, Professor Teng. And just now you mentioned the utilization of retired teachers. Now the national government also introduced a policy of advanced age teachers to utilize their retirement period to provide education in rural areas. And next, I would like to invite Professor Martin Valk to share with us your opinion.
Thank you. I will not center too much now on payment of teachers or retiring teachers because we also take these measures. But question 4 really focuses on the role of an individual teacher. So, of course, their concern might be economic. Now, in Western Europe, I have to say that the big comparative study about income of teachers shows that teachers in our countries on average have what we call a median income level. So they are not poorly paid, they are not highly paid, though there is more and more demand to pay them more. Okay, I will rather focus on the challenges that teachers experience and the reasons why they stop teaching. The first one is the contractual base. In many European countries, starting teachers, they get short-term contracts, mostly to replace teachers that are on leave, pregnancy leave, or job rotation leave. And this affects teachers tremendously. The second thing is that very often starting teachers in the first 5 years, they have to change a lot classes, subjects, curricula, schools, so they don't have really a stable job. And then thirdly, you have this big problem about student diversity. I told you in some cities we have more than 100 different languages. Next to language, you have cultural values, differences, and so on. Now, if you look at the role of an individual teacher, of course, you can say, you can change the contractual arrangements. That's what's happening now. So a teacher gets now a job in one school for 2 years immediately. So no changes there. But what we especially, in fact, push is, in view of the role of the individual teacher for retention, is to promote professional development in the school, and with a focus on the problems they really experience in that school. So multilingualism, poverty, cultural values that are different. I know in the Chinese system, and I greatly appreciate the Chinese professional development system, well, we don't know this system. We don't have this system. In many Western European countries, the professional development of the teachers is not that well established because teachers have to teach full time. Okay. The second approach is that we try to move away from individual teachers, and that more and more we organize teacher teams, so that especially starting teachers, immediately they have a kind of buddy, they have teammates to in fact join their concerns and to start maybe co-teaching. Co-teaching is now a big thing in many countries in Western Europe, where teachers share a teaching responsibility in 1 or 2 classes. And this seems to solve lots of problems in dealing with diversity and so on. And then in line with this, because curriculum development is also a key element of a teacher job, we in fact promote now, especially in the Netherlands, in Germany and in Belgium, teacher design teams, where teachers in the school with their colleagues, they rethink the structure and the approach of their teaching in the specific context with their children. And this results in fact in teachers that are better able to cope with the situation and experience better well-being, better mental health, and stay longer in the job. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Martin Valk. You mentioned three aspects. First is the contractual arrangement, whether it's short-term or long-term. In Beijing, we have a good practice. If you adopt the non-official contract, the teacher's salary will be higher. I think this measure is very suitable for some remote areas, and this can effectively solve the current problem of insufficient teachers. And I think the rural areas can learn from this method from Europe. And the second is a professional development. Professor Martin Valk has traveled a lot in China, have observed that the teachers in urban areas have many development opportunities, but the rural teachers have less development opportunities. And in urban areas, actually, we have sufficient number of teachers in. So such experience need to be transferred to rural areas. And next, I would like to invite Professor Li to share with us your opinion. Our first three speakers have mentioned that this is a very important topic. Just now, Professor Teng talked about the integration of pursuit for wealth and benefits and the pursuit for ideal and dream. And just now, Professor Martin Valk from Belgium also talked about the three aspects. So for individual teachers, in the process of provision and retention, they play a very important role. And we discussed the macro policies and the implementation of the policies. We talked a lot from the external aspects. However, finally, we need to boil down to the individual teachers themselves, and we need to address the essential problems for the provision and retention of rural teachers. And the problems of rural teachers in China, from my opinion, is very complicated. Just now, Professor Teng mentioned a very important concept, that is the historic perspective for rural education. To put it in a historical context, the rural education is very complicated, compounded by the real problems now. I think individual teachers play an important role in rural education. We need to pay attention to three aspects. First, the identification or identity of rural teachers for their occupation. There is a trend or phenomenon of the marginalization of the rural teachers. And the rural teachers themselves also regard themselves as rather low status, and they do not quite identify themselves for their profession or occupation. So when we conduct training, we have a strong sense of that. Many rural teachers, they lack confidence in their profession or in their occupation, and they fail to transform their advantages to their understanding to the profession or occupation. And second problem, many researchers today have no expectations for rural teachers beyond their jobs. Now the government has introduced a new rural teacher policy, and we are discussing how we mobilize the rural teachers to contribute to rural revitalization. And rural teachers will become active players in rural revitalization. And rural teachers will also participate in rural governance. Actually, such are expectations for rural teachers beyond their jobs. I think we need to be precautious on this, because we need to put the role of individual teachers in the realistic context. The teachers need to, first of all, play their role as teachers. In addition, in the training and cultivation of teachers, in terms of the support to the development of rural teachers, actually we have many discussions on the salary or income of teachers, rural teachers, is of great importance. However, when we talk about the rural teachers, we will inevitably talk about the salary for teachers. And when we engage in projects in rural education, we hope to make some changes. And there are some phenomena that the rural teachers in the rural areas, actually they are not qualified for the education, but the teachers themselves feel that they do not feel the atmosphere of academia. So in many cases, we fail to establish a very academic atmosphere for teachers. Of course, I am also a teacher, and I deeply understand that a strong sense of profession and achievement is very important for teachers. This is an important force for teachers to contribute their strengths to rural education. So I think from the perspective of salary, honor, the sense of honor, we need to make efforts, and more importantly, we should cultivate the teachers with a sense of achievement and a sense of pride, so that they will have their own dignity, so that the individual teachers will better play their roles in the provision and the retention of rural teachers.
Thank you, Professor Lee. 2 points you mentioned, I really agree with you. Scholars, when they publish the articles and when medias are covering reports about the rural teachers, we should take a cautious attitude. We should not impose non-professional responsibility on the rural teachers, which might adversely influence the rural teachers' feeling about themselves. Time is limited. Next, we will invite all the speakers to provide one suggestion or one wish to conclude today's open talk. Just a very simple one suggestion or one hope. And then we'll come to the Q&A session. Right now, we have thousands of audience from the Bilibili website. We have also gathered some questions from the Bilibili website. The floor is yours, Professor Teng. Professor Lee, besides the national mechanism on interest to encourage teachers to stay in the rural areas, I think to encourage millions of rural areas, teachers to stay in the rural areas, first, they should love the rural areas, they should love the rural education. If a person has no feeling for the raw soil under his or her feet, then it's impossible for his or her to stay there for a long time and dedicate him or herself to the education there. So when we cultivate the rural teachers, we should focus on the students, local students, because they surely have a strong love for the people, for the soil there. So it's important for them to stay there. And also, how to improve the cultural confidence of the rural teachers. Recently, I visited a county in Zhangye. There's a university, Hexi College in Zhangye. When we had the meeting, I talked with the party secretary of that college. Recently, I participated in a talk with the national leaders. And the leader, they recognized Hexi College. Frankly speaking, Hexi College is not so famous in China, but it deserved recognition on the high level national leaders. because many of its graduates from the Hexi College chose to work in the south area of Xinjiang area, and the students from Hexi College, they choose to stay in the Xinjiang remote province for a long time because they get along with people there. They like the climate, they like the culture. 10 years ago, I did a survey in South Xinjiang. There is a lack of 14 teachers, and we resort to the special post teacher program. And we hire some teachers to work in the South Xinjiang, but they only stay there for 1 or 2 years. After that, they will left. So when we choose rural teachers, we should choose a teacher who love that area, who love the rural education, who love the people who live in rural areas. This is very essential. Thank you, Professor Tang. We'll give the floor to other 3 professors to give us some concluding remarks. First is Professor Lee. Thank you. One line suggestion. So my suggestion is for rural education, we should send teachers to the rural areas and ask them to do a good job there, and also provide the rural teachers to be able to move to other areas and to have promising professional development. Thank you. Professor Volk, for rural education, for rural teachers, do you have a suggestion or a hope?
Oh, yes, thank you. You see, I had many, and I selected now one because I'm only allowed to have one dream for these teachers. I would emphasize again the essential role of the school communities. Of course, we can wait for policies. Or of course, we can blame the individual, but I think we should consider the social support mechanism that can be provided in a school setting. So the solution we now have, where we develop larger school communities in which schools work together, that seems to work because it's very close to teacher. It really respects their autonomy, their professional status. So they can be hired in such group of schools. And there what we see is that initially, in these communities, the job definition of starting teachers is changed. So they don't get a 100% job at the start. They still get a lot of time to develop themselves. So it's 60 to 80% positions, but they are paid 100%. They are allowed to job rotate. They're allowed to do co-teaching. They get professional development in these school communities. So that would be my main dream for the future, is in view of attracting teachers and retaining teachers, to foster, in fact, this community development and making teachers, not the individuals, part of a group. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Volk. We now have 6 questions, but since we only have limited time, we will select 1 question to answer. So I will read all the questions. The first question is, just Professor Volk has talked about the national policy in Belgium. He already answered. The second question is the implementation of rural revitalization. Are there new requirements for teachers' quality? This question is for Professor Qin. The third question is how to see the influence of the quality of the source of the students on teachers' development, because there are many stay-home children whose parents are working in the cities. They are vulnerable group. And Professor Lee, how do you see the teacher's role who teach all the subjects? And last question, how to see the phenomenon that some rural teachers, they work in the rural areas, but they live in the city? Last question is, the last question is, is it equitable, is it fair to encourage rural students to work, to go back to the rural areas to work there as rural teachers? So the professors and the speakers can give us verbal or written answers. I read a lot of questions. So the teachers online and on-site, is anyone who are willing to answer the questions? I like to answer one question about the source of the students in rural areas. For the supply and retention policy, I talked that who are supplying the teachers to the rural areas? And also, there are different types of universities who cultivate different types of teachers. For the mainstream universities who provide teachers to work in the rural areas are the type 3 universities. Frankly, they're not so good university. And when we hire rural teachers, we can see that in Middle and West China, we have programs like the special post teacher programs and the teacher assistant programs. We only have limited programs. For a teacher to become a rural teacher, first, he or she need to get a teacher's qualification, and second, they should pass the teacher entrance exam. To become a rural teacher, the supply of the rural teacher from the entry point has determined the quality of the rural areas will not, the quality of the rural teachers will not be as high as those in the city areas. So special focus should be given to the student source of the rural teachers. If this problem is not well addressed, it's difficult for us to improve the teacher quality in rural areas. We can see in China that mostly it's rural students later become the rural teachers. We did a survey previously that some rural areas, their teacher decided to work in the county or to work in the city. Some students, they choose to flee away from the rural areas because of the poor infrastructure. They do not want to live. They do not want to live in the rural areas. But when after 10 or 15 years of education, we encourage them to go back and to work in the rural areas. Frankly speaking, they are not willing to do so. And also, we talked about the rural customs. Some rural teachers, they don't know about their rural customs. They don't know about the plants. They're not familiar with the traditional customs. This will not help them train and educate their students.
Actually, to cultivate the students who cultivate the teachers who can teach all the subjects is also very important, and it is a fundamental practice to improve the quality of rural teachers. Actually, for some students, they were trained to be a teacher who can teach all subjects from primary school. Actually, it is very important So when we design the education system, we can adopt such a measure. And what is the concept of all subjects? Another question, another problem I would like to propose is that we need to pay attention to the cultivation of teachers, rural teachers in primary schools. And I visited a primary school in rural area. They do not have a strong foundation in the subjects in primary school. And we also lack the faculty for teaching in primary schools. In this area, we are still lacking. And we also recognize the concept of cultivating teachers who can teach all the subjects. I think these are the issues we need to pay attention to. Thank you, Professor Li. Professor Qin, do you have anything else? Maybe you can draw a conclusion in 1 or 2 sentences. Due to the time limit, I'd like to draw a brief conclusion. And in terms of how a rural teacher should be presented in rural schools, in the education area, I think this issue concerns the future of rural education. We should create an enabling environment for rural. At the core lies in the development of the rural teachers themselves is quite important. So the rural teachers should orient themselves as the educators, and actually to become rural educators, a good source of students is a basic guarantee. Maybe we have enrolled many high quality student source, but maybe they will not return to teach in rural areas. So we need to retain such students after they graduate. We will enable them to come back to rural areas to teach. And we should also provide a specific training to them. And the recognition and the identification for rural teachers is also very important. We should not equal rural teacher as simple or low level, etc. We should correct our understanding for rural teachers, and the practices of rural teachers are also fertile land for their growth and development. They need to realize their important role, and the professional and institutional support is also very important for the development of rural teachers. So I have a proposal that we should discuss an issue, namely how the rural teachers improve their self-confidence and how the rural schools improve their self-confidence. And we should provide support from different aspects. Thank you. The self-confidence of rural teachers and the self-confidence of rural schools are a very good topic for us to discuss in future events. Actually, for rural teachers, they are not easy. And I myself was also educated by rural teachers, so I have deep empathy for their difficulties and their values. Actually, rural teachers bring hope for rural teachers. They are just like a torch of hope. They will illuminate the bright future for rural children. So under the framework of UNESCO INRULED, I'm looking forward to inviting more excellent experts and teachers to join our platform and contribute their insights and experience on the improvement of rural education. Due to the time limit, we come to an end now. I especially thank Professor Teng, Professor Valk, Professor Li, and Professor Qin for your participation. And Professor Kibitini has already been offline due to network connection, and I would also like to thank nearly 1,000 online and offline guests. I'm looking forward to meeting you in future events, and I also look forward to meeting you face to face after the pandemic is over. Thank you. Thank you, our simultaneous interpreters, for your hard work. Thank you.